Well, good evening. Good to see you guys tonight. Somebody asked me how I was doing. I said, I'm anxious. So I'm in a good spot. We have a conversation tonight. It's a mental health conversation. And the title is this: Why Your Relationships Are Giving You Anxiety and What to Do About It. Now, one thing you should do, though, is don't keep nudging the person next to you when you hear something that is something they're producing, okay? But we're looking forward to it tonight. We have our speaker tonight is Katie Kuhlman, and let me tell you a little bit about her. She knows what she's talking about. She has served the Omaha community as a licensed counselor since August of 2022, and before that, she worked at Nebraska college campuses as an advisor in both academic and spiritual organizations for about 8 years. And she holds a bachelor degree in leadership from UNL and a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling from the University of Nebraska in Omaha. And tonight we're going to give her an honorary doctorate after this talk tonight. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, she gave me a little bit of information. She's going to be talking about anxiety tonight and the topic that you looked at that even brought you here tonight, but she herself knows what she's talking about. She has experienced anxiety in her own life. In fact, she said that she got a dog to help her with anxiety, to kind of be able to transfer some of that attention from the anxiety she was facing to actually put her attention on her dog. Now that creates an interesting dynamic because that was a lot of pressure for her dog, don't you think? So her dog had to go into therapy for anxiety. Just kidding. But they actually support one another in this whole thing. Her dog's name is Theo. It sounds like a big dog. Right there. Oh, there we go. So there's Theo. And so Theo is a support dog. So tonight we're looking forward to what Katie has to share. I want to let you know that after Katie is done with her presentation, she's going to open it up for some Q&A time. And that's a fun time, too, because questions come from all directions. And so that'll be some good discussion. So if a question comes up in your mind, in your own circumstance and situation, and hang on to that, because there'll be some time that you can just raise a hand, and I'll run around with a microphone after Katie's done with her presentation, and we'll try and answer some of those. So why don't you give just a big warm welcome to Katie as she comes and talks to us. Thanks, Katie.
Yeah. Thanks. Hi, guys. So, yes, I also struggle with anxiety, so welcome. And it's funny because you said that we had to take him to therapy, my dog Theo, for anxiety, and it's a very real thing. We paid thousands of dollars to kind of nip the anxiety in the bud with some training. So, yes, it did kind of backfire, but he's our baby. That's also my husband, Michael, just to let you guys know a little bit of who we are. He's right up here. God bless him, being married to a therapist. I'm born and raised in Omaha. I'm going to move over here so that I don't have to look behind me and keep all of that. Is that okay that I'm over here? Yeah. Yep, got a bachelor's in agricultural education. Studied a lot of cows and agricultural economics and really wanted to be a vet, and here I am. And yes, so my preferred client base, because I work a lot with anxiety, tends to really focus in on anxiety-specific disorders, OCD, body image, and disordered eating. So that's kind of like my specialty that I work with a lot. Last thing, I'm a Costco connoisseur, love everything Costco. This whole outfit's Costco, so you're welcome. Just a little fun fact about me. So I'd wonder if any of you guys have felt like anxiety was really keeping you from truly connecting with somebody in your life. There's so many different relationships, right? There's marriage, there's friendships, there's coworkers, there's bosses and supervisors, there's parent-child relationships, there's dating, there's community leaders, there's pastors, there's elders, there's in-laws, and there's just family, right? There's so many different relationships, and to say that people wouldn't experience anxiety in these relationships, pretty unrealistic overall. So my goal tonight is to kind of dive into what is it, why is it there, and really what do we do with it? Because ultimately, It's not that we're broken. It's not that that's something to be fixed. It's more of how can we understand it and utilize it to foster connection with people rather than to drive division and distance. Does that sound like a good plan? All right, we'll kind of go to that next slide. That's okay. Okay, so Brene Brown's one of my favorite people. One of her quotes is, "It takes courage and self-awareness to recognize relationship anxiety as a part of our journey towards intimacy and connection." I love this quote because it pretty much addresses the fact that relationship anxiety is a guaranteed. It's not something that we can all just avoid or make sure doesn't happen. It's recognizing that it's a part of our journey, and it's ultimately a tool. It can connect us if we learn how to understand it and if we learn how to use it to our advantage. For example, I felt nervous and anxious a lot. So in therapy and becoming a counselor, you have to do 3,000 hours of supervision. That means every single week you meet with somebody to basically tell you the things you're doing well and the things that you need to work on, okay? And every single week I'm nervous for supervision because I'm pretty much signing up for somebody to tell me, hey, you have to work on things, right? And I felt nervous about that. It kind of created this anxiety. I was nervous about what my supervisor would think about me. I would hesitate to bring some of my challenges or some of the things that I was really needing help on because it feels really uncomfortable to get criticism, right? And it can create this sense of anxiety because I had this fear of criticism or of being in trouble because I didn't do something right. But I could also take that opportunity to say, what is it trying to tell me? If I'm nervous for this, and I don't want to do something wrong, it could point me to the fact that I actually really care about my job and I really want to do a good job. And my supervisor is there to help me do a good job, right? So I can utilize that anxiety and understanding it to start a conversation with my supervisor, communicating, hey, I kind of don't know if I know what I'm doing right now. And I feel like I have a really hard time doing this, and I'm nervous to come to supervision because I'm nervous to hear all the things that I'm doing wrong. And it provides an opportunity for me and my supervisor to feel closer, more connected, and as though she's actually a support system. So that's kind of an example of like how we can really utilize anxiety to communicate to us, hey, what can I do with this? How can I understand? And it can bridge me into a journey of intimacy and connection with other people. Now, I do want to throw a little caveat before I kind of jump into everything. There are millions of different kinds of relationships, like I was saying, and there's millions of different reasons to be anxious. And I want to say that this presentation addresses relationships between good-willed individuals and well-intentioned individuals. This is not a conversation for anxiety within the context of toxic relationships or chronic abuse. And if that is something that you're wondering, if that's something that you're facing, find a trusted person, a safe person to talk to. I'm happy to also help you navigate a little bit of that after the presentation to really see what that is, because this would not apply to that, right? Sometimes our body is telling us we're anxious because the relationship is very much so unsafe, and that's a really good thing for your body to tell you. And we can utilize that to create space for health rather than leaning into this. But this conversation is so that we can lean into relationships that are good-willed and well-intentioned people. Okay, so we'll kind of jump to that next slide. Another quote, we must remain open to the possible failure in relationships if we want to experience deep connection with one another. Relationship anxiety is just a part of being alive. So if you're in this room, you're alive, and I'm happy you're here. Okay, we'll get started on that next slide. Thanks so much. So why addressing this matters? Social isolation and loneliness are linked to poor mental health and physical health outcomes, including increased risk of cardiovascular disease, dementia, depression, anxiety, and premature death. The health risks associated with social disconnection are comparable of smoking 15 cigarettes a day or having alcohol use disorder. This is research done by the American Psychological Association. Relationships are crucially important, not only for our mental health, but also for our physical health. It is extremely devastating, even for our physical bodies, to experience isolation or disconnection in our relationships. It requires, ultimately, some individual work and self-reflection to combat these consequences and intentionally swing upstream towards health and healing. We don't need to be the victims of isolation or unhealthy relationships. We can take autonomy over the patterns within ourselves and the habits that have led to the consequences of isolation and lack of connection. It takes work, it takes humility, but it can lead to change if we're willing to take responsibility for the roles that we play in some of our isolation and disconnection. This quote at the bottom, if we change within the relationship, we change the relationship completely. A lot of times we can be really focused on what the other person is doing. And my goal tonight, if you leave with anything, is that if you change, if you create change in your relationships, you're changing the relationships completely. We can't control anyone else, but we can change the relationship just by changing how we view it and how we act within it. We'll kind of go to that next slide. Thanks so much. This is an overview. I clearly did a long intro. You're welcome. We're going to go over why anxiety happens, why anxiety interferes with our connections with other people, what roadblocks and barriers to authentic connection exist today, and then practical behavioral-based tools to help manage our anxiety and foster connection. I want to make sure that I'm giving you guys tangible tools. This is some of the basics that I go over with a lot of my clients that come in with anxiety. I'm kind of giving you guys the rundown of one of my first couple sessions with people. So this is kind of what we're going to walk through, and that's what it's going to look like. All right, so why anxiety happens. Next slide. Okay, so the amygdala, the fear center of the brain, is responsible for detecting threats and initiating the fight, flight, and freeze response. When someone is anxious, their amygdala, it's right here in the back of the brain, becomes really hypervigilant and overfocused, meaning they're constantly scanning for danger, even in safe environments. It doesn't matter if it's safe. If the amygdala is activated, we are scanning for danger, okay? Research shows that individuals with anxiety disorders have increased activity in the amygdala, and it's a little bit bigger in the brain, which reinforces this tendency to perceive harmless situations as threatening. Our brain tends to bookmark our negative experiences, so it ends up living predictably based on past experiences, right? And the reason that it does that, it bookmarks it, and it says, hey, this feels familiar. This hurt in the past, so let's do what we can to avoid this or fix this right now. Even if it's relatively safe, and even if it's not going to be exactly the same way. Our brain is predicting that it's going to hurt really bad. It's a survival mechanism, and it's useful in dangerous situations because it can help us live predictably when we need to be predictable. I don't want to walk up on a really dark alley all by myself and be like, that looks safe to walk through, right? Like, anxiety can be really helpful if we listen to it. So it's expecting the worst even when the present situation doesn't warrant it. And as a result, we become stuck in a loop of anxiety, anticipating negative outcomes before they even happen and before there's really even a threat for them to happen. On this next slide. Okay, so the brain's protective wiring. These relational wounds that we have from the past are very real. I don't want to negate the fact that these wounds happen and they're there, right? So bullying, rejection from authority figures, instability in relationships, these all leave emotional scars that leave us more sensitive to these perceived threats. These experiences also shape how we're going to interpret interactions in the present moment, causing us to project these past pains and past experiences on all of these new relationships. So if I had an old boss that really hurt me with a lot of their criticism and I get a new job, I'm expecting my new boss to do the exact same thing because a boss and a supervisor can feel really threatening to me, right? Even if that boss gives me no reason to expect them to do that. So these experiences shape us, right? And it's causing us to enter into these patterns. When we operate out of this, we're operating out of self-protection. And unfortunately, self-protection leads to a lot of self-sabotage, and we unintentionally create the outcomes that we're really trying to avoid. And this is where confirmation bias comes in. We see what we expect to see, right? For example, if we expect people to reject us, we may interpret like a neutral or even positive social response and social cue as a sign of rejection, right? If I'm expecting you guys to think that my talk is kind of pointless and that I'm full of hot air and you wish you weren't here, then I'm going to notice every time you look down into your lap or scroll on your phone and interpret that as rejection. I'm going to see what I expect to see. Does that make sense? Research ultimately shows that individuals with some attachment wounds or wounds within a relationship are more likely to misread social interactions and ultimately make connection even more difficult, which perpetuates this cycle of isolation. But again, anxiety does not mean you're broken. Your body is trying to tell you something with your emotions and trying to tell you that whatever you're feeling is really important, and it can be used well. For example, I had a friendship once, not once, she's definitely still my friend, but I moved here to Omaha for grad school in 2019. I grew up here, but I was living in Lincoln for like 8 years previous, and I moved here, and I had to pretty much start over with friends, right? So I made a friend, relatively new, and we were both new to our community, and it was amazing. We hit it off really early, but while we were friends, we started getting plugged in, and she started making other friends, right? And I wish this didn't happen, right? But there's this like feeling of jealousy and of like, oh, well, what if she likes these other friends more than she likes me? And what if I hear that she's spending one-on-one time with this friend, she just like didn't want to spend time with me because she likes her better, right? I was able to recognize, okay, this means that I really care about this friend. This means that I really care about this friendship, and I should probably communicate that to her. So I was able to confess to her, hey, I really cherish you as a friend, and I noticed that we're making a lot of new friends, and I just need you to know that I love you and I care about you, and I really want us to prioritize and be intentional in this relationship, because we all know making friends as an adult is next to impossible, right? So being able to communicate that to her and have that conversation led to a friendship that's now 7 years along, and it's beautiful, and I love her dearly. And it provided that opportunity, whereas jealousy, envy, and fear of rejection could have just as easily sabotaged that relationship. Move on to that next slide, because this is also a huge piece of anxiety within the context of relationships, which is perfectionism and the fear of vulnerability. And I know that I am not the only person in this room that has ever felt that, and I know that every single one of you guys have at least some point in some relationship in your life, right? Perfectionism often drives people to prevent a flawless version of themselves, hiding their true thoughts, their true nature, and a lot of their authentic beliefs, thoughts, and emotions, right? This desire to appear perfect prevents authentic connection because others are really only seeing a curated version of who you are. Even when we're surrounded by people, we still might feel really deeply isolated because no one actually knows who we are, because we've instead presented this curated version of who we are. Research shows that individuals who struggle with perfectionism oftentimes report higher levels of anxiety and depression despite external achievements or despite their curated position or status that they've presented for other people. And when we avoid vulnerability, we unintentionally create emotional distance from others. A lot of times this fear of vulnerability is out of a desire to really be accepted, known, and loved by other people. However, when we avoid those vulnerable opportunities because of the fear of rejection, we are ultimately playing the role and the part for why we feel disconnected from that person. Vulnerability is what allows us to truly connect, but the fear of being hurt or rejected keeps us guarded. This avoidance fuels a cycle of disconnection, making us feel more and more isolated over time. And studies show that individuals who avoid vulnerability often have insecure attachment styles and fear lack of safety in relationships, regardless of the health of it or the safety of that person, which can make it harder to build trust and ultimately emotional intimacy. Brené Brown has another quote that I love that really resonates, one for me, but I know for a lot of my clients. And she says, if you trade your authenticity for safety, you may experience the following: anxiety, depression, eating disorders, addiction, rage, blame, resentment, and inexplicable grief. I'll read that again. If you trade your authenticity for safety, you may experience the following: anxiety, depression, eating disorders, addiction, rage, blame, resentment, and unexplainable grief. As somebody who has struggled with these things, it has been exactly this. It has been the journey of becoming more comfortable with vulnerability and more comfortable with stepping into this sphere of vulnerability and being my authentic self and helping my clients do the same so that these other issues can resolve. Because these issues and our anxiety, our depression, our addictions, our disordered eating is all a symptom of the fact that we feel afraid to be ourselves. We'll move on to that next slide. And then there's this whole other component called technology, social media, news media, all that good stuff. And I do want to caveat, technology is not in and of itself bad or evil, okay? Technology can be a helpful tool, and it can oftentimes aid in connecting people. It's more of the cultural shift that has happened since its introduction on the scene, right? As this culture has shifted, it's led to a lot of different relational issues in every generation. No generation is exempt from this reality. Social media and technology and news media has significantly impacted our ability to form authentic connection. And this isn't just a problem for the teenagers and the high schoolers and the college students and those of us addicted to social media, right? It affects all of us. It's easy to believe that we're immune and kind of point fingers at other people for being addicted to their phones or the news. But this kind of thinking ultimately leads us to victim mentality, right? And pointing at other people saying it's their fault that I don't feel connected. When we believe that we are helpless to change, we ultimately become stuck and unable to build these authentic relationships with other people. And research shows that increased screen time is linked to higher levels of loneliness and reduced relationship satisfaction. That does not only include your phone, folks. Cancel culture, and without getting too much into it, right? But cancel culture has created this environment where disagreements are met with complete elimination rather than repair. The news cycle does this, right? This prevents us from learning how to navigate conflict. And navigating conflict is what builds stronger connection. Without the ability to work through differing opinions, many relationships end before they're even allowed to grow, right? Research highlights that the ability to repair after conflict is the key predictor of long-term relationship success and emotional trust. Little shout out to Joe's talk. You can catch it online, I'm pretty sure, and he goes through exactly how to work through some of those communication things when it comes to conflict. In today's digital age, we'll kind of move on to that next slide. Oh, here we are. You were there, I think. Yeah, there we go. In today's digital age, many people, nope, it's the next one. Okay. In today's digital age, many people perceive their online personas and their social media profiles and how they post and do everything on Facebook as their most authentic self. And a lot of times we perceive other people's Facebook profiles or Instagram profiles or whatever as their most authentic self. And we become very disconnected from who we really are and who they really are. It becomes nearly impossible to form deep and meaningful connections with other people. And research shows that authentic connection and self-expression are connected. They play a crucial role in fostering emotional intimacy and maintaining this satisfied relationship. Authentic connection happens offline. It happens when we put away our devices and engage in real face-to-face interactions. And vulnerability and trust grow in these spaces when we can truly be seen and known. I will say that I am actually not anti-technology very often, and I think cross-generational relationships, whether it's grandparents to their teenage grandkids or parents to their teenagers or children, it's important to know how to compromise on the initiation of relationship through technology versus building the relationship through technology, if that makes sense. I know a lot of times it can feel really frustrating for a grandparent to say the only way that my teenage grandkid will talk to me is through texting, and I totally understand the sentiment and I get it, but a lot of times it can take some of that initiation through that to create ways and means to get that face-to-face connection. And I'm all for Zoom and FaceTime too, because that does kind of bring that and bridge that gap. So, what do we do with all this information, right? I just threw a lot of whys at you, and if I don't give you the tools, you all can look at me and be like, okay, so what? Like, that sounds actually kind of hopeless, and what do I need to do? We need to get tangible, right? Dr. Margaret Rutherford, she says, when relationship anxiety arises, try taking a few moments to step back and evaluate what exactly is making you feel anxious. This will help you identify what is causing the relationship anxiety and how to better deal with it. And these tangible tools on these next slides is exactly what I'm going to try to do with that, okay? So, let's go on to the next slide. Good job. Yep. Okay, perfect. Cognitive restructuring, also known as thought challenging. Okay, this is a skill. This is a tool, and we're going to practice it. I'm not going to force you to talk to your neighbor, but it's coming, so mentally prepare. Okay, this is foundational behavioral therapy techniques, okay, aimed at ultimately rewiring the brain. It helps individuals recognize cognitive distortions, and that's basically a fancy tool to say lies that we believe, and challenge our thoughts and challenge those lies and replace them with more balanced and realistic perspectives. Studies show that cognitive restructuring is highly effective in reducing anxiety and ultimately enhancing the relationship satisfaction. So we'll go on to recognizing cognitive distortions. It's the first step that we have towards changing them. We'll kind of go on that next slide. Okay, so some of the cognitive distortions that we have here and common patterns that typically get us in trouble, okay? Mind reading. We all do this, don't we? We all kind of think we know what they think. They must think I'm too much, or they must have thought that I talk too much, or they must have thought that I was awkward, right? We mind read and we start creating these narratives in our head. There's also the catastrophizing. If I share my feelings, if I bring up this conflict, our relationship is over, right? We start believing some of these narratives that our brain is trying to flag, like, hey, remember that one time that this happened? This is potentially another chance for that, right? Our body's telling us that this is important, we need to do something, but it's also telling us it didn't go well at one point in our life, right? We got black and white thinking. If we argue, the relationship is doomed, kind of that all or nothing. We have overgeneralization. I felt awkward with those people. I'm always awkward. I'm never not awkward, right? Personalization. My boss is irritated. She wouldn't be irritated if I did better on my project, right? We're taking somebody else's mood and making it our fault or making it an us problem. Fortune telling. I just know that they're going to yell at me if I bring up this conversation again, right? Convincing ourselves that we know exactly what's going to happen before it happens. And then ultimately, emotional reasoning. I feel like a bad friend, so I must be a bad friend. I feel like we're disconnected, so we must not be compatible, right? We use a lot of our emotions to explain that this must be reality because I feel that it is so. And these cognitive distortions oftentimes get us in a lot of problems, right? If anything, it puts us in a position where we feel helpless and hopeless, and it's like, kind of, what's the point in trying anything different anyway, right? And it puts us in a position where our relationship is doomed from the start, which would, of course, make anybody anxious if you care about that person, right? On this next slide, we got how to challenge these distortions. We need to identify these automatic negative thoughts, okay? So if we are in a social situation and there's a circle of people, okay, and they're all chatting and doing all their stuff, and you're kind of like the one person off, and you're like, okay, well, they're the only other people here. I should maybe go and step in, but I feel really awkward, so I just must be so awkward. They must not want me there, right? We need to identify, hey, I'm actually assuming and catastrophizing and mind reading that I know exactly how they think and exactly how they feel, and what if I listened to that and I challenged it, right? So we need to ask reality-based questions. What is the evidence for and against this fear? Okay, so in the context, right, of this circle of people who are talking and I'm kind of off on my own, right? What's the evidence for this fear? I am the one person not in this conversation, right? I am the one who would be inserting myself in. What's against this fear? Well, I know that they're my friends, or I know that we're here for a social gathering, so it wouldn't be that awkward if I, went to be social, right? And we can kind of argue back and forth of like, okay, what is my evidence for being afraid of this? To challenge our brain and say like, okay, maybe this is a little bit valid, right? But also, where am I going too far? Where am I drawing a lot of conclusions that are probably unfair, right? And am I interpreting this shift or situation objectively, or am I interpreting this situation emotionally? We want to distinguish between rational and irrational fears. Now, irrational fears comes with the whole thing. I don't want to call anybody in here irrational, but the difference between rational and irrational is rational is real and proven. Irrational is imagined, okay? Real and proven and imagined, okay? So an irrational thought could be, well, they should invite me into this conversation, okay? Maybe, but they haven't. So it's an imagined solution to this problem, right? So it's an irrational thought because I could rationally insert myself into the conversation. Does the difference make sense? It's not so much of like you're thinking irrationally and you need to fix that. It's more of challenging our brain's automatic, imagined solutions to this versus the realistic and proven ways that I can create a solution to this. Research shows that challenging our cognitive distortions and really challenging them is going to reduce relational conflict and improve our own emotional regulation. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide. So again, understanding rational and irrational thoughts, I kind of skipped ahead a little bit, right? But rational thoughts are based on evidence and reality. Irrational thoughts are distorted and exaggerated shoulds, shouldn'ts, all of those good things. Rational emotive behavioral therapy, one of the things that I utilize a lot with my anxious clients, improves emotional resilience and reduces relationship anxiety because it puts you in the driver's seat because we can create rational solutions to the things that we are bothered by. So the trademark of behavioral therapy, and we kind of already touched it, is this awfulization factor. That'll be on the next slide too. And awfulization and catastrophizing are pretty much the same things, and they're these cognitive distortions that put us into irrational thinking where we assume that the worst possible outcome and then we magnify its impact, okay? So in relationships, awfulization often leads to avoidance, emotional withdrawal, and disconnection. So catastrophizing would be, if I bring this up, they're gonna be really mad at me, okay? So that's the worst possible outcome, maybe for you. To magnify its impact, it would be this person, if I bring this up, they're gonna be really mad at me, and I'm gonna awfulize that by saying, and they'll never talk to me again, okay? We're taking it to this extreme, and we're making it terrifying. Of course that's terrifying. If we have conflict, and we're telling ourselves that if I bring it up, it's ultimately gonna result in the absolute end of this relationship, we put ourselves in a bit of a pickle, right? We can't rationally address this with a solution because our irrational brain is telling us, don't do anything. You're not allowed to speak up. You're going to lose everything you hold dear, okay? So the way that we want to challenge this awfulization is this truly the worst that could happen? And I know that sounds like a tricky question because it feels like it's absolutely the worst thing that happens. But we want to step out of the emotion. We want to say, is this really the worst thing that could happen? Okay? And if that worst case scenario happens, can I handle it? Right? We oftentimes in our anxious brains don't give ourselves the opportunity to wonder, can I cope with that? Can I handle it? Right? We put ourselves in positions where we can't even solve our problems anymore. And research confirms that by addressing oftentimes these catastrophic or awfulization responses and using some of those challenging techniques will reduce our avoidance and boost our relationship confidence, okay? So I want to utilize an example. This is something that I feel like I oftentimes see in my office with my clients, and I'm sure everybody here has experienced this at least once. So let's say you text a friend, right? Or you call a friend, you phone a friend, you message a friend, whatever. And you see that it was read, or you know that they read it and responded, and they have not responded to you in a week, okay? And maybe that message was really important. Maybe it was something that you were expecting a response from, right? And we start kind of considering all these what ifs. Well, what if they read it and they're really mad? And what if they read that and they don't even know how to respond to me? And what if we're actually not friends anymore? And what if the list is endless? I could give you endless thoughts and doubts of how that might go, right? So we need to put ourselves in this situation, trying to challenge these awfulization thoughts, right? Trying to challenge these catastrophic conclusions that we assume have already happened, and ask ourselves, well, what's my evidence for this fear? What's my evidence against this fear? And let's say this fear happened. Let's say that they're no longer wanting to communicate to me based off of this text message, okay? It's hard, it's painful, it may hurt, but if it happened, can I cope with it? And putting ourselves in a position of like, yeah, I could initiate another conversation. I could go up to them in person and try to have a conversation. I could even challenge my thoughts and say, no, I actually remember that their kid was going through a sleep regression and they've probably only gotten 2 hours of sleep all night, or they've been really, really busy, right? We can start challenging these thoughts and putting ourselves in a position where we're no longer helpless and hopeless in the relationship, but we can take initiative and we can create connection, utilizing what our emotions are trying to tell us without going to this worst case scenario. Okay, on that next slide. So oftentimes, these distortions can ultimately become core beliefs. And this is one of the things that I mean, a little plug for therapy. I'm a therapist, so I clearly believe in it. But a little plug for therapy is these core beliefs can happen out of constant and chronic experience with these anxieties, right? Maybe you deeply, truly just believe yourself to be an awkward person, and you don't believe you have any chance of not being an awkward person, and you're not really sure anybody knows how to be friends with an awkward person, right? And that's going to create a lot of anxiety, and that's going to become this core belief, and they become so ingrained in us that all of our relationships become characterized by what we believe about ourselves. The reality is you ultimately have a choice, right? We don't have to believe these things. We can challenge them, and a lot of times it takes a good amount of support from friends, family, safe people, a trusted therapist as well, to really start challenging on that. But if you already kind of have an inkling, right, in the back of your brain, and you're like, oh, I do believe that when people don't text me back, they just don't like me anymore, right? If we know that that's a core belief, we do have the choice to challenge it or just continue to believe it and let our anxiety win, right? Again, with confirmation bias, we ultimately see in relationships what we expect to see in relationships. And it's a way that our brain is trying to protect us. It's just not working anymore. If we're constantly anxious in our relationships, our brain has clearly become overprotective, over hypervigilant, and now it's preventing connection when all you want is to feel known and loved in your relationships. And the only way to really work through that is to challenge the beliefs that your brain has so desperately clung onto by challenging them after we identify exactly what they are. And one of the other solutions for that, is intentionally looking for the positive evidence. Look for the good, look for the helpers, look for the people who you know love you, and practice challenging your distortions with the people who you know and love. That's another key thing with relationship anxiety. Practicing with random strangers all the time, not your best bet, right? We want to be able to practice safe, healthy, anxious-free relationships in the context of healthy ones. And so I'm identifying whatever healthy relationships you have and really being able to practice what this is saying when you're anxious in these safe relationships. I oftentimes do this with my husband too, right? I can say I feel, I'm a woman. I know all women here struggle with body image, right? And so if I'm believing in these core beliefs that like, I just feel icky and I feel like people don't like me because of it, right? That's not an absurd thing to think, right? But in the context of a safe relationship, I can externally verbalize that and practice challenging that belief in the context of a safe relationship to prevent that from leaking into all of these other relationships that I might not feel so safe and secure in. All right, on that next slide. Okay, so practical application. This is when you could do this by yourself or you could talk to somebody that you came with, okay? This is the practical application and just kind of next steps, okay? We would need to identify automatic thoughts and distortions. We want to challenge them using evidence-based questions. What evidence do I have for this? What evidence do I have against this fear, right? And we want to replace those negative thoughts with more rational thoughts, okay? It doesn't remove the fear or the negative thought as much as it does provide your own devil's advocate thought, okay? And then we want to look for positive patterns in relationships. So this first example over here, the negative thought is, I got into trouble at work. They'll probably want to fire me soon because I can't do my job right, okay? Negative thought. Immediate. Doesn't take a lot of effort to think that, right? Boss was in a bad mood. You got in trouble for taking a break too early, and we immediately jump to the conclusion, they're probably just going to fire me soon. Of course, that's going to make us anxious, okay? Our rational counterstatement, by identifying that I'm catastrophizing, that I'm awfulizing, and that I'm mind reading and predicting the future, I can ask myself, what's my evidence for this and what's against it? And come up with this rational counterstatement that says, I made a mistake at work. But everyone does that from time to time. I usually get a lot of positive feedback about my work from people. I'll be careful not to make that same mistake again. I'm probably going to be okay, right? It doesn't remove the fact that we made a mistake. It doesn't even necessarily remove our anxiety about making a mistake. But it doesn't take it to the extreme that puts our body in this fight, flight, hypervigilant, anxious out of our mind mode. Does that make sense? All right. So, again, you can do this by yourself if you want. I'm not going to force anybody to have a conversation with people they don't like. But I would like you, if you could, to turn to somebody near to you or a journal on your phone, whatever, and kind of work through these two other negative thoughts. I'll give us 4 minutes. Can we handle 4 minutes, guys? Okay, 4 minutes. Turn to somebody. We're going to go over this first negative thoughts, and then we'll kind of review it after 4 minutes. Does that sound good? Okay, break. Talk amongst yourselves. Got like 1 more minute. You guys are doing great. All right. I love that you guys are chatting. I didn't know how that was going to go. All right. So our first negative thought. I did a lot of talking when I was with my friends earlier. They were probably annoyed that I talked so much and think that I'm too much. I'm sure a lot of us might have had this thought at some point, right? But what are some of the cognitive distortions in there? I'm seeing they were probably annoyed, so some mind reading. I talked so much, seeing that as my behavior might have caused some weird looks or little side eyes, right? Saying that my talking behavior was wrong or bad, which is an assumption made, right? And they think that I'm too much. Another mind reading and catastrophizing thought, right? A rational counterstatement, if we assess the evidence, right, for or against this. For this, I mean, sometimes people get irritated when somebody talks too much, right? It's typically not after a one-off thing. So my evidence against that is that typically people can speak up, and if I'm in a group of adults, then I can trust that somebody's going to have a conversation with me if I offended somebody or did talk too much, right? So the rational counterstatement. I did a lot of talking when I was with my friends earlier. I was really excited about the content of our conversation, and if they thought that I talked so much, I'm sure that somebody could have that conversation with me, and I can even maybe ask somebody if they thought that to see, because I can utilize that anxiety to bridge connection rather than emotional distance and avoiding the next social gathering, right? Okay, next negative thoughts. My friend seems short and uninterested in our conversation. I must have done something wrong to make them upset with me. Okay, so there's some mind reading in here, and there's also some personalization, right? We assume that my friend's disinterest or being short is all my fault. I must have done something wrong. Evidence for that is maybe their mood, but if we don't have any evidence that we did something wrong and we can't think about it, then that's probably going to be thrown out the window, right? So a rational counterstatement would be, my friend seems short and uninterested in our conversation. I don't remember doing anything wrong or hurtful towards them, and I can trust that they might bring that up to me. So maybe my friend's having a really bad day. Maybe I could ask him about it. We get to utilize we get to utilize what our emotions are trying to tell us to bridge connection and intimacy and not distance or avoidance. Good job, guys. Way to be team players. All right. Okay, we'll move on to that next slide. Okay, so I got some additional tips and tricks for us, okay? This first one is basically doing it scared, all right? We want to lean into some of these small, manageable risks and initiate opportunities for connection, starting some of those difficult conversations and inviting other people to share experiences with us and do shoulder-to-shoulder time. Our avoidance of these circumstances will make our anxiety worse. It just will. If we're avoiding something, we're telling our brain that it's something worth avoiding and worth being afraid of. If we're waiting to feel less anxious, we reinforce the fear that it's worth something to be afraid of. Our confirmation bias grows, and we keep our anxiety cycle intact, okay? Our research says that ERP, which is exposure therapy, basically, reduces anxiety by 60 to 70% when consistently practiced in anxiety-provoking situations. If you're waiting for yourself to do the hard, scary things when you're no longer scared, you're going to be waiting the rest of your life, right? And so being able to step into some of these small and manageable risks with safer people to be able to practice it is something that is really, really helpful. If our anxiety is severe and nothing feels manageable, a trained counselor can help you approach exposure therapy in a systematic and safe way. So I don't want anybody to do this if it's like triggering panic attacks, right? That's going to require some additional professional support. But for most of us, if we're feeling anxious, the key is to lean into it. Lean into some of those manageable things with some of those safe people. Okay, we'll move on. Mindfulness and present moment awareness. This is another thing that therapy can really help you train in, but the idea is that our anxiety really distorts how we perceive time, and we begin to worry about the future or ruminate on the past and really get ourselves stuck in the future or the past, right? And we're no longer present-minded about the evidence of this current situation, right? We're no longer assessing this current situation and its safety. We're remembering all of the past times or the future times it could hurt, right? So some of these grounding regulation techniques are things to bring us back to this present moment. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 is using all 5 senses. So I think it's like 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can feel, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste, okay? It's just bringing us back to this centered, sensual reality right here. We can do some box breathing, which is deep breaths in, hold, deep breath out, hold. And being able to just bring us back to this present moment. Cold exposure is the same thing. Cold exposure, in Nebraska last Wednesday wasn't that hard. But in the summers and the 80-degree weathers, that can oftentimes just be ice cubes in your hand or running your hands under cold water in the bathroom, okay? And then a safe presence is just bringing some of those safe people with you and some of those small and manageable risks that we want to practice taking. Research shows that mindfulness reduces anxiety by 38 to 58%. I don't know how they get these numbers, but they're there. And improves our ability to emotionally regulate in that present moment. So these are some things that we can practice and tools when we are leaning into some of those manageable risks. The next helpful tool is going to be some values-based decision making. And I know I'm throwing a lot at you. I'm trying to get to Q&A without talking too much. We want to identify some of our core values in relationships. So if you really value trust, if you really value fun, if you really value faith, right? We want to start making decisions about our relationships utilizing those values at a foundational point, right? So if your faith is very, very important to you and somebody or this relationship, there's a lot of anxiety about the fact that they're may be hostile towards that. It's not to completely avoid it as much as it is, can I utilize evidence? Can I utilize these rational and irrational statements to lessen my anxiety, to promote connection and not just cut off and create distance, right? We can move on from that. Boundaries. I won't dive too much into this. Boundaries are about defining limits in your relationship. This is a little plug for Wendy's talk. She's the next talk for the mental health thing, and she's diving all into boundaries. And boundaries are one of the most helpful tools to reduce relationship anxiety. So I was a little jealous that she stole it from me, because that probably would have been the main tool that I focused on. But she's going to give you a whole night on boundaries and how it can help with a lot of this relationship anxiety. And we can kind of go to that next slide. Okay, so when is it time to seek professional support? I know I gave some caveats in the beginning about what relationships this doesn't apply to. I also mentioned, if we're having panic attacks, we need probably additional support. If there's trauma involved, we probably need some additional support, right? So we need to recognize that maybe we have a strong desire for change in our relationships, but we just feel stuck. And my emotional and physiological response to things, I recognize that it's disproportionate, but I really have I just can't challenge that because my emotions are so elevated. That would be a time to seek support. Indicators for seeking therapy is also if you don't really have that safe person. A lot of times therapy is simply providing a safe person on the other side of the room that'll hear you, listen to you, and provide some context for what a healthy relationship might feel like if we don't have any, right? And then consistent use of tools and resources with little progress. So if we're continually trying to identify and challenge our thoughts without really any progress in our anxiety, that also might be an indicator that therapy could be a really helpful thing or professional support could be a really helpful thing. Research is showing that therapy improves emotional regulation and relational health by 70 to 80% in those with unresolved anxiety and trauma. So if there is that unresolved anxiety and trauma that we're really working against the grain, that'd be probably one of the little yellow flags that I'd say, okay, let's maybe try out some therapy to be able to practice these things on a really more regular basis in a systematic way to provide support so that you guys are seeing the results that you would like to see at a pace you'd like to see it. Okay, and our last little slide. We're going to skip that. Thanks. Your next steps. So your next step after tonight's. Your next steps would be implementing the cognitive restructuring and cognitive challenging tools, okay? Challenge yourself with some small steps, leaning into vulnerability in some of those safe contextual relationships with authenticity and doing it scared and not waiting for the anxiety to just magically disappear. And then consider seeking professional support if this has become so overwhelming that it's actually interfering with your ability to have a good quality of life and relationships. So I think that's it. We'll kind of move on to that next slide. We'll kind of start a Q&A, but also if you guys could do us a huge favor, CityCare is doing this community care initiative, and this is kind of the pilot program. You guys are our guinea pigs. We love that. We appreciate you guys. We would deeply appreciate some feedback on my talk tonight. Help me to improve. I probably talked too fast or talked too much. That's okay. I would love to hear it. And CityCare would love to know what you guys would think would be a really helpful implementation of this idea of community care for the future so that we can help maybe implement it on a grander scale. So we'd really deeply love and appreciate that survey feedback whenever you would have the opportunity to do so. And then we can get the Q&A started if anybody has any questions. I know Bryce said he would run around, so you love Bryce.
Yeah,
I also can't promise that I'm going to know all the answers to all the questions.
You can.
Joe did such a good job last time. I was so intimidated.
You can defer to Joe, or you could phone a
I'll phone a friend.
Yeah,
I'll tell Joe to get up here, and he can tell everybody, give little sessions from stage.
Yeah, if you have a question for Katie, you can just raise a hand. Here's one.
So do you have any suggestions for good books or anything like that along this topic?
Oh.
That you would be like, hey, this is a pretty good pointer to, continue this.
To continue this, exactly.
Right.
Okay. Wow, putting me on the spot. I have like a whole little library at home. I could tell you all the colors of the covers. I don't know if I can tell you all the titles exactly. Favorites, I would say, so Boundaries by Henry Cloud is one of my books that I walk with almost all of my clients through. And again, I know that's what Wendy will kind of touch on next time. The idea of boundaries is basically the expectations that we put on relationships and ourselves, and how really we get bulldozed in those expectations, and it puts us in a position where we feel like we're carrying all the weight and pressure to make sure that these relationships go how they quote unquote should, right? That's like my number one book for anxiety in the context of relationships specifically. Yeah. If I think of any more, I'll toss them at you. Yeah.
Okay, what would you suggest, again, talking about technology and the phones?
Mm-hmm.
So, family time, you're out with friends, you're with family, people are always picking up their phone. Instead of having that face-to-face conversation, just really trying to be intentional with your time with one another. And how do you bring that up? I mean, how do you just, without being a nag?
Yeah.
Oh, mom, or
right.
I even find this in the workplace. It's really a distraction, and I find, just kind of setting those boundaries and expectations with employees when they're coming in talking, and they're checking their phone, they're checking their watch, and it's like, so
right.
How do you approach that?
Yeah, what's your name?
Jennifer.
Hi, Jennifer. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, such a good question. There's so many different ways and approaches that we can go about that. The one of the things that I would love to propose on the ways that our culture is utilizing phones is it's really easy to get frustrated. And I hear you. My husband and I always have conversations about we got to put our dang phones down, right? However, really trying to take a step back and take the perspective, okay, like what purpose is this phone serving? Because it's really easy to, with the cognitive distortion, right, personalize it. Like they don't want to be with me, right? They think that what's on that phone is more important than me and our relationship. And what a lot of the research is saying about technology is that it's actually an avoidance tool. And if they're avoiding something like connection with the people in front of them, or they're avoiding maybe work because they're scrolling or whatever, it's typically an avoidance tool from something that's right in front of them. And if there's avoidance, there's typically fear. And most of us can't even necessarily like identify that that's like the subconscious drive to pick up our phones, right? But a lot of this doom scrolling reality is an avoidance tactic of this stressor right in front of me, or that conversation with my spouse, or like, ugh, like it just sounds like work and I feel tired and it's probably gonna be draining, right? There's this fear that this relationship is gonna drain and I can just like scroll, right? Whatever the fear is, I'd love for us to take a step back and say, okay, this, instead of taking it personally, there is some sort of subconscious drive that they're trying to avoid something, right? And if we can do that, we end up having a lot more compassion, which can kind of nip some of that nagging in the bud, right? However, when it comes to family systems too, and not so much the workplace, but this could happen in the workplace, but you probably don't have as much control over it. But kind of defining family values, right? So that values-based decision making and having conversations with the family or with your spouse or with your roommate or whatever about what values do we really prioritize, and doing that at a separate set aside time where I've set aside this time. We're going to talk about what our values are for this family. And then we're going to talk about how we might want to implement that and some of the barriers that are getting in the way of that. So that conversation has happened on the front end. Everybody's on the same page of what our values are as a family. And we've all agreed that technology and the phones are interfering with actual connection, with having fun together, with stress because mom's mad now, and we're putting a lot of pressure on this time to have fun, and now everybody's just mad at each other, right? And kind of having that conversation on the front end so that when we go into these dinners at restaurants or dinner at the table at night or whatever it is, the expectation's already clear that like phones aren't coming out. Does that make sense? It's trying to nip the conversation in the bud way before that, utilizing values and compassion rather than I'm frustrated because now it's hurting my feelings. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
It does, thank you.
Okay. Again, there's so many different families with so many different things, so I don't want to step on anyone's toes.
You have another one? Okay. Yeah, might as well.
So you talked about the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 and the 4, 4, 4 breathing. Can you go a little bit more into that? Like how does that work? What would you do and the steps? I unless I missed it myself, then you can just go ahead and skip it.
Yeah, I went super fast over that slide.
Okay.
I was like, I need to have some time for questions. They told me to wrap it up at like 7:50. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 is the idea of I know that I'm going into a situation that is probably going to heighten some of my stress and or trigger some of that hypervigilance into my anxiety. So the idea of mindfulness is going in knowing that I may be stressed in this situation. And this could be relationships, it could be before a soccer game, it could be before we go into a conflict resolution or a test at school, right? And I know that this is going to take my anxiety level up a little bit. The idea is when I'm anxious, I want to understand, okay, I'm predicting that this test isn't going to go well. I'm worrying about the future. I'm anxious about how this is ultimately going to end up because I'm just stuck in predicting how it's going to end up, right? So the mindfulness technique is utilized with the 5 things you see, 4 things you hear, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. You can also mix those up. It's not any like exact science, but the idea is by when I notice that I'm anxious, I want to start bringing myself back to the present moment. And it's basically like tricking your brain into focusing on like, okay, I see a red exit sign, I see a blue shirt, I see a chair, I can touch this stand, I can, touch my watch, play with my ring. right? It's putting us into this moment, and when I'm focusing on trying to find those things I can hear, smell, taste, feel, touch, like all those things, I'm distracting my brain from that future rumination. Does that make sense? Or that future anxiety. The box breathing, that physiologically forces the brain to utilize oxygen, and I don't know all the science and brain science behind it, but it forces the brain and the body physiologically to slow the heart rate down and to decrease those physiological like tightening symptoms that anxiety can oftentimes bring, like those tight shoulders or the tight chest or that like stomach knot.
How does the 444 method go then?
Yeah, so you'll breathe in for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, breathe out for 4 seconds, and hold for 4 seconds.
Okay.
Just over and over and over again. And sometimes the counting is even what the brain needs to get out of the past or the present, or past or the future rumination, worries. Yeah, so that'll physiologically calm the entire body down.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you much.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions?
I guess this one kind of flips it a little bit.
Yeah.
Like if you know somebody is struggling with anxiety and like just communicating with them in a way, is there like tools or strategies that work well where like you can continue to build the relationship, but like not while trying to not induce anxiety for them, if that makes sense? Like,
Yeah.
like if you know that a conversation is going to cause them to kind of spiral, like, but you still want to have a conversation, like how do
Right.
you approach that?
Right. What's your name?
Jared?
Jerry. So what I'm hearing is that you really, really care about your anxious friends, and I love that. So what I will encourage everybody in is that if we take on that pressure to make sure that other people don't feel a certain way, oftentimes that'll make us feel some of the like emotional pressure that we're not meant to feel. So the idea with your anxious friends is not so much to prevent their anxiety as much as it is to step into it and ask them how it's going. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Is that answering any of the question? Is there a more
yeah.
specific example?
I don't know. I'll think about it. If I
No,
can think
it's
of
okay.
a more specific example, I'll
No, yeah.
let you know.
I will say, this was an example that I was going to use. I will say that if there's an initiation of a hard conversation with somebody that you know has a lot of anxiety about relationships, a lot of times it's being as upfront as possible, as soon as possible, without a lot of time in between that conversation. So let's say that you have to initiate the conversation or schedule the conversation to maybe have conflict. Probably the worst idea for anybody that struggles with anxiety is like, hey, we need to talk, right? Nobody likes getting that text. However, if we're able to communicate, hey, I would love to have a conversation with you. I deeply care for our relationship and friendship, and I think that this conversation is important. I'd like to discuss X, Y, Z. Is there a time anytime soon that we would be able to do that? Basically communicating as much of the applicable information as you can up front to leave as little question marks as possible is typically the best way to engage with somebody that you know struggles with anxiety, is to eliminate as many question marks as possible in your communication. But yeah, if there's any clarifying in that, I can do that too.
Maybe, oh, there we go. Good. Hey, your husband's going to ask you a
My husband's
question.
asking a question. Everyone's
Gonna
going to
ask
get
you to-
staged. Now I'm nervous.
He's going to ask you the hard question.
The hardest one. So, the beginning, you had one takeaway, and you had so much stuff. I'm trying to remember what it was.
Oh, great. No, I'm trying to remember what it was. I think the biggest takeaway that I wanted to have everybody leave with was that we don't have to feel helpless or hopeless in our anxious disconnection or the anxiety in the context of a relationship, and really leave knowing that we have tools to change the way that we behave in our relationships. Because if we change within the context of the relationship, we change the entire relationship, because we're 50% of it, right? And so if we're able to eliminate a lot of our anxiety or challenge our cognitive distortions and no longer have these confirmation biases or see what we expect to see in the relationship that will ultimately lead to some self-sabotage behavior, if we're able to really take ownership and responsibility for how we are contributing to our own anxiety in the context of the relationship, we can typically make those well-intentioned, good-willed relationships infinitely healthier just by changing the way that we perceive and communicate in them. And so just leaving knowing that we're empowered to create the change that we probably want to see in our relationships and connection. So
That
I
was
think
it.
I was on the spot. I'm like, oh my gosh.
Yeah. If we change, we can change the relationships. That really stuck
Yeah.
with me. So thank
Thanks
you.
for that.
Any other questions? Katie will be around afterwards, so if you did want to speak with her personally about anything, I'm sure she'll be available afterwards. I'll grab my notes here. Great questions, you guys. And Katie, great job. I was thinking, and I want to remind you about the questionnaire too. If you do a little follow-up on that. Katie mentioned, maybe you thought I talked too much or talked too long. I think those are cognitive distortions.
They are. You're right. You
I
called me
learned
out.
something tonight. Anyway, thank you so much, Katie.
Did you
Let's
have
give Katie a hand.
Did you have
She
a
did
question?
great. Oh,
Oh, okay.
How do I do this if I don't have my phone with me?
Joe? Do you think it's okay if you don't? If you don't, you don't. That's okay.
okay.
You can give
Okay.
me your feedback right now if you'd like. I'll take it.
Okay.
She could, yeah. Yeah. Right, it's just another
Oh.
form she can use. Yeah,
There you go.
that too.
That'd work.
Wow, somebody was at their phone. That's like a unicorn. Wow.
Cool.
Amazing. Thank you guys so much. I
Yeah,
appreciate
thanks,
the
Katie.
time.
Let's give her a hand. Awesome. Next talk coming up, she mentioned it and gave Wendy a shout out, but it's going to be on boundaries, and yeah, very related in a lot of ways, but there's so much to the subject of boundaries. We title it this way, protecting yourself without pushing people away, the balance of boundaries. And so really in healthy relationships, there needs to be some good protective boundaries. So that'll be a good conversation. And we'd love to invite you to the next talk. You know what? I don't even have that date with me right here. Do you have that? May 1st. Okay, May 1st, same time, Thursday night, 6:30 to 8. So I would love to just close this in a word of prayer. Thank you so much for coming out tonight and supporting this, and I hope that it was helpful. I know there was a lot of information shared, and I think real practical too, so thank you so much. So let's just pray in closing. Father, thank you so much for Katie and for the talk she gave tonight. I pray, Lord, that you would remind us of some of these things as we go through our own struggles at times with anxiety. Lord, I pray that we'd be able to step back and use some of the tools that she shared tonight, and I pray that we would be finding ourselves being able to navigate in a healthier way and building healthier relationships as a result of these things. So thank you for each one. Just go with each one, protect and guide and bless. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks for coming.